Hi, everyone. So, for this week, we are going to be diving into some deeper content that followed kind of closely with what we would have been doing typically at this time in the regular school year. So, what I have for you is I've created a video in which I kind of go through my PowerPoint slides that I've created just in case you couldn't watch our virtual meeting throughout the week. So, you can still work on the assignments. I'm going to present my screen now, and you'll be able to see the PowerPoint. So hopefully you can see my screen right here. We are going to be focusing on empires, and this would have been our next unit after we finished up Unit 3. Now, Unit 3 was, again, talking about civilizations and what it takes to make a civilization. Whereas in Unit 4, we are transitioning to what it takes to create an empire and how a lot of the times the River Valley civilizations that we studied turned into empires, and those empires then changed, collapsed, rebuilt, and went through a long period of history here. So, to get started, the first thing that we talked about in our virtual meeting was a city state. And I asked the students what they thought a city state was. So, if you want to take a few minutes right now and kind of think about what a city state means, what that word means, what it maybe looked like, and was it the same as a civilization? Was it different, and why? So take a few seconds here before I move on to the next slide that says what a city-state is. Okay, so a city-state is a city that has its own power structure and identity and is not controlled by a larger body like a country. So some examples of city-states throughout history could be Rome, Athens, Carthage, Sparta. All of these are cities that have their own power structures, meaning they have their own governments in place, they make their own rules, they make their own laws, they have their own identity, meaning that they have their own culture and they have their own way of life. And they're not controlled by a larger body like a country. So they weren't controlled by some bigger entity than themselves. We, for example, live in North Branch. And in North Branch, we are considered, I guess you could consider it a city, but we are not a city state because we are controlled by a larger body. We're controlled by the state of Michigan, and then the state of Michigan is controlled by the United States, which is the country. So we would not be considered a city state. However, there are some examples of city states today. An example of that would be the Vatican City. Now, the Vatican City is in Europe and it is and acts like its own government, even though it is a city. And this is where the Pope lives. And they have their own power, they have their own government, they have their own identity, and they're not controlled by a larger body like a country. It's literally called the Vatican City, but it acts like a country. So that would be an example of a city state. Now, the next question I pose for students is, what is an empire? That's the focus for Unit 4, what an empire is and what they're made of. So, what really is an empire? How is it different than a civilization? What are some characteristics of an empire? Give you a couple of minutes to think about that one. Then I'll move on. Now, hopefully when you were thinking about an empire, you came up with that it's bigger than a city state. It's bigger than the River Valley civilizations that we've talked about. And if you did, you're exactly right. So that brings me to my next question. Why would empires grow out of city states? Why would these city states eventually become an empire throughout history? Give you a couple minutes to think about that one. So, again, like I said before, we are at a turning point in history. Era 2 was all about civilizations and the making of the civilization. We learned about agriculture. We learned about what a civilization needs to be successful. We're now entering into Era 3 in history. And I just want to show you, before I talk more about Era 3, I just want to show you a couple of different maps to show you the differences between Era 2 and Era 3. So right here, this map on the left-hand side should look familiar to you. This is a map that we've looked at already in class. We looked at this while we were studying our River Valley civilizations. You'll see right here, this red one in Africa, that is ancient Egypt. We have Mesopotamia. We have ancient India and ancient China. We also see the main rivers, right? Egypt has the Nile River. Mesopotamia has the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. India has the Indus and the Ganges rivers. And China has the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. Okay, so that is Era 2. Now we jump forward a little bit and we look at Era 3. This looks very different. We see some differences here. We see some empires, right? If we look to where ancient Egypt is, this now has become the kingdom of Meroe. There's the kingdom of Abyssinia. If we look north to where Mesopotamia was, this has become the Parthian Empire. We also see the Roman Empire up here. That wasn't even inhabited before during our Era 2 discussions. If we come down here, ancient India has definitely grown, and we see that this has become the Kushan Empire. And finally, over here in ancient China, we also see that this area has grown and become the Han Empire. So, obviously, there are big differences. This map over here in Era 3 also points out some trade routes. And trade is very important through these empires. We have the Silk Route or the Silk Road. That is something that we are going to learn about later, and it is very important for the success of these empires. If I go down to the next slide, we have a couple of different maps. Okay, this shows you just some different empires that came to be during Era 3 because Era 3 was constantly changing. New empires were forming, old empires were falling, some were regaining strength, retaking over areas. It was constantly a battle of who was going to be in charge. So I know this map is a little bit more difficult to read, but we can see with these different colors what some of these empires were and where they were located. So before, we know in ancient China it was the Han Empire. However, now we see the Qin Empire. We learned about that when we were talking about ancient China. We see the Greek city-states, very small over here in that coral color. Carthage, again, that was another city-state that we talked about. It's over here on the northern parts of Africa and southern parts of Europe. We see an area of Roman control. Okay, that's where Italy is. Macedonian, this is a huge empire throughout history, and that's this peach color. Then we see some other empires. These ones aren't as big, but the Mauryan Empire, that is another big empire, and you can see that that one is right here. Now, I also included this map down here just to kind of show you. We've talked about Alexander the Great a little bit. He was a man that took over huge parts of the world. You can see how big his empire stretches. It is massive. And this was in 323 BC. So he has a huge empire right here. And we'll talk more about that later. So I have some notes down here. Basically, the main points of these maps, it was to show you that empires are constantly changing and new people are coming into power. There were also empires developing in the Americas. So before, when we were just talking about our ancient river valley civilizations in Era 2, there wasn't any activity going on in the Americas. However, now in Era 3, we do have people venturing into the Americas and creating civilizations and eventually empires. However, those empires looked much different, and we're not really going to focus on them for this discussion. We're primarily going to stay in Afro-Eurasia. And remember, Afro-Eurasia covers Africa, Europe, and Asia. So here's the definition for an empire. Actually, we're getting there. Not quite yet. But basically, the biggest change, obviously, you saw in the two maps was the development of empires from Era 2 to Era 3. Now, to have an empire, we have to have certain characteristics, just like we did with civilizations. And remember, those characteristics needed to have a civilization were geographic luck. Our civilizations, they had to be by river valleys. They had to be by those rivers so they could get water. Remember, river valleys were very fertile areas. They had great climates, and they were perfect areas to grow crops and domesticate animals, which allowed for farming. We can't have a civilization without farming. Farming was the basis for every civilization in Era 2. Once we had farming, we could then make a surplus. Once we had that surplus of food, then people began to do different jobs. They began to specialize in different things. And finally, with those specializations come social hierarchies, right? We have people up at the top who rule over, and then we have people at the bottom, like your farmers and your slaves. So, some characteristics of an empire. The biggest one, obviously, is militarism. And militarism is just this. It's basically the belief of a government or people that a strong military is important and necessary, and that should be used aggressively in the perceived interests of the nation. Now, I know that's a little bit wordy. So, what that essentially is saying is that the government or the people of that empire, they develop an army, develop a military system, and then they use that military, they use that army to, how do I want to put this, to aggressively advance their empire. So whether that means taking over the nearby town, they're going to use their military to take over that town. Or maybe it's to take over a water source, right? They need another water source to help develop food for their people, because farming is the basis for all civilizations, and civilizations turn into empires. So maybe they need to take over that water source. They're going to use that army to take it over, that military. Now, I have some bullet points down here. It says, without a strong army and a belief that it should be used, empires probably would have never developed. So basically, what that is saying is, if people didn't believe in militarism, they didn't believe in having this strong military, empires probably wouldn't have developed. And the reason for that is because empires, they were so power hungry, they wanted to control the neighboring regions so bad. They wanted to get as much land and resources as they possibly could, that they just got bigger and bigger and bigger. If they didn't have that mindset, empires wouldn't really have developed, and we would have just had our smaller civilizations or our smaller city-states. And history would have been changed forever, because these empires are a huge part in history. Another bullet point I have down here is empires are held together by force. People don't necessarily enjoy living in that empire. They may, but a lot of times it's by force that they're forced to live in that empire. They're forced to be there. They were probably taken over, and they have to abide by these rules. And if they don't, they're going to have severe punishments. And those could be, and in a lot of cases, were either slavery or death. Empires also consist of people that are different ethnicities and speak different languages. So, again, because these people are taking over, these militaries, these armies are taking over so many distant regions, they are accumulating all these people into their empire. And all these people, they speak different languages, they look different, they have different skin colors, different cultures. So, empires are multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual. They're all these different things. And it's just kind of this huge melting pot of different cultures and languages and religions and just types of people. And they don't all get along all the time. Oops. So, some more key points I have. I kind of already said these, but empires rose and fell. Centers of power shifted, but the same areas were fought over. So that's just basically going back to what I said, that people were constantly coming into power and they were also losing power, but it was always over these same pieces of land that people wanted the power over because they were either rich in resources, they were close to water sources, they were great for farming, lots of different reasons that people wanted this land. New empires often conquered existing ones. They didn't start from scratch. So I have an example here. This Persian army conquered Assyrian territory. So the Persian Empire conquered Assyria and they brought them into their empire. So it wasn't the Assyrian Empire anymore. It was the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great, remember his huge empire back here in this picture? He conquered lots of smaller empires and then he brought them into his. So we don't see random small empires just popping up all over the place. It's empires taking control of other empires and bringing them into their own. And then right here it says, over time, the center of power in Afro-Eurasia shifted westward with the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire later in history becomes super powerful. And we have some things with trade. Empires trade a lot. We have mixing of societies like I talked about. Cultural diffusion. So again, lots of different cultures coming together and they don't necessarily all believe the same or act the same or speak the same language. They stick to their own cultures a lot of the times. So some more key points here about empires. Talked about those already. They developed systems and bureaucracies to manage people and resources. So they did have some type of system where they were going to manage people and manage resources like crops. They had those systems put into place. Did they always work? No, not always. There were issues with them or people didn't want to follow the rules, whatever. But all of these empires, and they were different too, going from one empire to the next, but they all put in place these systems that they would hopefully help to make their empire run more smoothly. Here we see that they built roads. We have expanded trade networks, which is really important. Oops. We also have religions for empires. But a lot of times these empires, because they are bringing in all different types of people, they allow other religions to be practiced. And eventually empires did decline. And they declined for different reasons, of course, but for the most part, it all revolves around the fact that there was conflicts over power and eventually empires just got too big and they couldn't control all the people, so there were rebellions and then they split up and just all different situations happened, but it basically just revolves around who was in charge. Now, just like there was a feedback loop for civilizations, we have one for empires as well. And if we think back to civilizations, remember our feedback loop, more people leads to new problems lead to new solutions, higher production, or new solutions lead to higher productions or new technologies, and then that loop just keeps continuing. We have the same thing for empires. The more people we have, the more resources we have, that leads to a need for government, right? They have to control those people. They have to control those resources. Once we have a government, that leads to armies, government systems, taxes. We have to have a way to expand, hopefully, with our armies or with taxes. We have to have a way to control our people. Once we have that, that leads to, like I said, we need more people, we need more resources. We have to continue this government, continue this army, continue this power structure. So finally, that leads us to conquest and trade. We want to take over different regions and or trade with those regions to help our empire become stronger. And again, that leads to more people and more resources. And you can see that this loop never ends. It keeps continuing over and over. Now, there are instances where this loop can break down. Where do you think that problems could occur? Because we said empires rise, empires fall. That's a continuing thing throughout history. So why would this feedback loop break down? Where do you think problems would occur? Now, I kind of said a little bit about it earlier. Really, the biggest place that I feel this feedback loop breaks down is right here, kind of. You have to have this feedback loop obviously go around a couple of times. However, once you have so many people and this empire stretches out so far, as in the case of Alexander the Great, his empire stretched so far. How do you have a place where you just control everything? They have their center of control in this empire, but how does that center of control stretch out all the way throughout the whole empire when we don't have things like instant technology like we do today or instant modes of transportation? They didn't have airplanes flying around like we do. How the heck did one center of government manage to control all of this? And really, that's where empires fall, is because they couldn't. They couldn't control all of that. So what would happen is people would rebel in different parts of this empire because they didn't like that they were being controlled. And then with enough rebellion, they could take over that empire. So that is why Alexander the Great's empire fell. It was just too big. It wasn't feasible to be able to control. So right here is somewhere where I think this feedback loop does develop some problems. Now, finally, is the assignment. And I'm going to create a separate video kind of going through the assignment. So thank you for watching. If you need to rewatch any of the parts, feel free, go ahead. If you have any questions about what an empire is and how they were created or why they fell or what characteristics of an empire means, anything about it, just let me know and I will do my best to answer those questions for you. So let me go back here. I'm going to stop presenting and we should be good.